The morning Lagos woke to rain was a morning everything changed. Not the dramatic kind of rain that announces itself. Not thunder, not lightning. Not the kind of storm that sends market women running for cover. This was a quiet kind. The kind that falls without permission and soaks into everything before anyone thinks to close a window. Adiz Nwosu Okafor stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass of the 41st floor and watched the city below dissolve into gray. She held her coffee with both hands. Not because it was cold, but because stillness required something to hold. She had learned that long ago. Stillness required an anchor. She had arrived at the building at 5:47 that morning, before the security team, before the cleaning staff finished, before her husband's car had left their home in Lekki Phase 1, where she had kissed him on the cheek, lightly, without expectation, and told him to drive safely. He had not looked up from his phone. There were things Adiz knew that she had never spoken aloud. She knew, for instance, that the woman Emeka had been texting for the past 11 months had a name. Tara. She knew that Tara had been given a new apartment in Victoria Island, paid for through a subsidiary account Emeka believed only he could access. She knew the exact figure, for ₦1,000,000 a month. She had reviewed the statements herself, quietly at midnight, while Emeka slept. She had said nothing. She had not said nothing because she was weak. She had said nothing because silence, wielded correctly, is not the absence of power. It is power in its most patient form. Downstairs, the city was filling with noise. Buses, Okadas, the distant sound of a preacher on a corner somewhere near the bridge. Lagos did not wait for anyone to be ready. It moved, and you moved with it, or you were left behind. Adiz turned from the window. She straightened her jacket, a deep navy Ankara-trimmed blazer that had been tailored for her in Abuja 3 years ago, the same week she had quietly restructured the company's entire equity arrangement. Nobody had noticed the restructure. That was the point. She walked to her desk, not the front desk near the executive assistant station, but the inner office, the one the building records listed under a corporate holding name, the one with the view no one else on this floor could claim. She opened her laptop. She reviewed 3 board documents. She approved a transfer. She signed, not as Adiz Okafor wife, but under the name that mattered in every document this company had ever filed with the Corporate Affairs Commission. The name no one in that building connected to the woman, who came in quietly, greeted people softly, and disappeared into the inner office before the day truly began. Her phone buzzed. It was not Emeka. It was her lawyer, Bar. Chizomies, a sharp, careful woman who communicated in short sentences and had never once wasted Adiz's time. The filing was confirmed this morning. You are aware of what happens next. Adiz read the message twice. Then she set the phone face down on her desk, picked up her coffee again, and looked at the rain. She was aware. She had been aware for 8 months. Aware of the plan. Aware of the paperwork. Aware of what the board would see when they opened their briefing packets at this morning's 9 a.m. meeting. She had arranged everything with the precision of a woman who had learned very early that the world did not reward those who moved loudly. She had been invisible for 12 years. Today, that would end, not because she was angry, not because she needed revenge, but because a company that belonged to her, built with her mind, her father's seed capital, her sleepless years, was being handed, piece by piece, to a woman who had never read a balance sheet in her life. There are some things a woman can forgive. There are some things she cannot. To understand Adiz, you had to go back before Lagos, before the 41st floor, before the empire. You had to go back to Enugu. Her father, Chief Emmanuel Nwosu, had been a man of modest land and a modest vision. He had not been wealthy in the way Lagos men understood wealth. Visible, loud, announced by the size of one's convoy and the shine of one's shoes. His wealth was in soil. In the 300 hectares of farmland outside the city that he had inherited from his own father and slowly, carefully, multiplied over 40 years. He was also a man who believed, against the opinion of nearly every elder in his community, that a daughter's mind was worth as much as a son's, perhaps more. Sons, he said, inherited confidence without earning it. Daughters, when given the chance, learned to build. Adiz had been his only daughter, and she had built. She had studied finance at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, graduated top of her class, and gone immediately into investment analysis at a quiet Legos firm. That was where she had met Emeka Okafor. Emeka had been brilliant in those days, or at least convincing enough to appear brilliant. He had the kind of confidence that filled rooms, the Legos confidence, the Yoruba mixed Igbo corporate accent, the handshake that lasted a second longer than necessary. He had ideas. What he did not have was capital. Adiz had looked at his business plan for what would become Okafor Holdings and seen three things: a real opportunity, a significant structural gap, and a man who would go nowhere without someone who understood numbers. She had gone home and spoken to her father. Chief Emmanuel had listened for 45 minutes without interrupting. Then he had asked one question: "Does he know what he is asking you to do?" Adiz had answered honestly, "No." Her father had been quiet for a long time after that. Then he had said, "Then make sure the paperwork knows, even if the man does not." The seed capital, 250 million naira, drawn from her father's estate fund, had been injected quietly, structured through a holding entity called Zora Capital Partners. On paper, Zora was an investment vehicle. In reality, it was Adiz's name, translated into corporate language. Emeka had launched Okafor Holdings believing he had secured a private investor. He had, in fact, secured his wife, who would, 3 years later, become his wife, in a ceremony in a Nugu attended by 400 people, none of whom knew that the quiet woman in the white lace had already been his company's founding architect for 36 months. This was the shape of their life. Emeka's face on everything, Adiz's mind in everything. She had not minded. At first, she had told herself that visibility was not the point, that building something real, something lasting, was its own reward. She had told herself that Emeka understood, even if he did not say it, that he knew, that on some quiet level, every time he walked into that boardroom, he knew whose intelligence had paved the floor beneath his feet. But Emeka had not known, or he had known and year by year had begun to forget. By their 5th year of marriage, Adiz had restructured Okafor Holdings 3 times, navigated them through a currency crisis, and expanded into real estate logistics and telecom. The company's valuation had crossed $5 billion, then 12, then 28. The board, 7 men and 2 women, all of them recruited through Adiz's network, knew her as a quiet executive consultant who moved through the company like water, present everywhere, never loud. Emeka knew her as his wife. His wife, who he had begun to say at golf clubs, was very supportive. His wife, who helped with documents sometimes. His wife, who, and this was a phrase that at first made something cold settle in Adiz's chest at a dinner in Ikoyi 3 years ago, keeps the home running so I can focus on the business. She had smiled that night. She had lifted her wine glass and touched it to his, and she had said nothing. Tara Ease had appeared 18 months ago. She was a marketing coordinator from the telecom division. Young, fast-talking, beautiful in the way Lagos men described as dangerous. She had attached herself to Emeka at a company retreat in Calabar with the efficiency of someone who had studied how these things were done. By month 3, she had a new apartment. By month 6, she had been promoted. Without board approval, Adiz had noted the head of brand strategy. By month 11, Emeka had presented a proposal to board Tara Ease as chief operating officer. The board had been surprised. 2 members had called Adiz directly, asking quietly if she was aware. She was aware. She had also, by that point, already begun preparing. Emeka Okafor was not an evil man. That was the thing people would misunderstand later when the story became known, and it would become known. He was a man who had mistaken comfort for permanence, a man who had looked at his life and seen what he had been given, without ever pausing to ask who had given it. He was also a man who had, that very morning, sent his wife a message in the company car, telling her there was a 9 a.m. board meeting she did not need to attend. It's internal, he had written, board only. Adiz had read the message on her way to the elevator. She had noted that he had not asked how she was sleeping. She had noted that he had not mentioned that her name, her real name, the one inside those documents, was on the agenda. She pressed a button for floor 41 and watched the doors close. The boardroom at Okafor Holdings occupied the entire eastern wing of the 41st floor. 16 chairs around a glass-top mahogany table. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. The Lego skyline behind it like a theater set, and that morning, the skyline was still gray, still wrapped in the remnants of early rain, still quiet in the way Lagos was never supposed to be quiet. By 8:15, the room had begun to fill. Adiz sat at the far end of the table. Not the head, not the foot, but one seat in from the corner. The seat she always chose. The seat from which she could see every face in the room without turning her head. Board members arrived in pairs. She greeted each one by name with the precise warmth she had always extended. Warm enough to be genuine, controlled enough to reveal nothing. She accepted a glass of water. She placed a leather folder on the table in front of her and did not open it. She was the only person in that room who did not look at her phone. Emeka arrived at 8:47. He entered the way he always entered rooms. First, with his voice. A greeting from men at the far end, a handshake for the CFO, a hand on the shoulder for the chairman of the investment committee. He moved through the boardroom like a man who owned it because he believed he did, and belief, Adiz had long observed, was 90% of how men like Emeka moved through the world. He saw her from across the table. For a fraction of a second, one fraction that Adiz registered and tucked away, something moved across his face. Not guilt, not warmth, something closer to calculation. He smiled. Ada, I thought you had a meeting in Abuja. It was rescheduled, she said. Ah. He nodded. Good. He sat at the head of the table. He arranged his folders. He did not look at her again. Therese arrived at 8:52. She entered differently from the board members. She entered with the self-consciousness of someone practicing confidence, the kind that had been very recently acquired. Her outfit was correct. A tailored ivory suit, Louboutin heels, a folder tucked under her arm like she had seen important women carry them. She moved to a seat 2 chairs from Emeka's right. She did not acknowledge Adiz. This was not an oversight. Adiz knew it was not an oversight because she had watched Tara's eyes sweep the room in the first 10 seconds after she entered, and she had seen the exact moment those eyes landed on her face and slid away, deliberately, like a stone skipping water. Adiz picked up her glass. She took one small, measured sip. The meeting opened with a financial review. Numbers that Adiz knew without looking at the paper. She had written the framework for these reports herself 6 quarters ago. The CFO presented with the slight nervousness of a man who sensed that this meeting was more loaded than its agenda suggested. Then Emeka spoke. He did it well. She would grant him that. He built to it gradually. The company's growth trajectory, the need for dynamic leadership energy, the evolving demands of the market, the importance of youth and momentum. He was smooth. He was convincing. He had clearly rehearsed. And then he said it. I'd like to formally present the appointment of Tara Ease as Chief Operating Officer, effective the 1st of next month. The room shifted. Not dramatically. This was a boardroom, not a market square. But Adiz felt it, the small tightening of attention, the glance that 2 board members exchanged, the way the investment chairman set his pen down with a careful, deliberate movement that many had things to say and was deciding whether to say them now. Bar, Funmi Adeyemi, the company's legal counsel and the only other woman on the board, spoke first. This appointment was not in the pre-meeting briefing document. Her voice was even professional and entirely without warmth. Can you clarify the approval pathway? We'll handle the paperwork today. Emeka said, I wanted to bring it to the board in person. The protocol, Funmi said, requires a 48-hour notice to all board members for executive appointments of this level. Funmi, I'm not debating protocol, Emeka. I'm stating it. A silence stretched across the table, like a held note. Adiz said nothing. She watched. Emeka moved on, smoothly, the way men moved on when they decided that an obstacle was temporary. He shifted to the expansion proposal. 3 new markets, 2 infrastructure acquisitions, a rebranding initiative that Tara had, apparently, developed. He passed slides to Tara's direction. She stood and began to present. She spoke well enough. The strategy was reasonable, not exceptional. The numbers had a few gaps that Adiz would have corrected in a first draft. But she delivered with the confidence of someone who had been told, by someone who loved her, that she was brilliant. It was during this presentation, around the 20-minute mark, when Tara had moved to a slide about ownership restructuring and new strategic direction, that Adiz finally opened her folder. She did not announce herself. She did not stand. She did not interrupt. She simply slid a single document across the table, to the investment chairman on her left. Quietly, without a word, the chairman looked down at the document. Then he looked up at Adiz, then back down. His hand moved to the glass of water in front of him. He did not pick it up. He said nothing for a moment. Then he passed the document to the man on his left. That man read it, passed it on. Within 4 minutes, every person at that table had held that piece of paper. Tara was still speaking. Emeka was watching the document move around the table with the expression of a man who had not yet decided whether to be afraid. Adiz folded her hands. She waited. The investment chairman finally spoke. His name was Chipa Batunde Coker, 71 years old, former CBN advisory board member, a man who had seen more corporate maneuvering than most people had had meals. He cleared his throat. Emeka, he set the document on the table with the care of a man handling something that mattered. I think we need to pause the presentation. Emeka looked at him. Chief Coker. This document, Chief Coker said, indicates that the controlling equity position in Okafor Holdings, 54%, is held not by you, but by a corporate vehicle called Zora Capital Partners. He paused. And that Zora Capital Partners is registered to a person who is in this room. The silence that followed was absolute. Tara had stopped speaking. Her slide glowed behind her, a bright, useless thing. Emeka's jaw moved once. Chief Coker looked across the table. Not at Emeka, but at Adiz. Mrs. Okafor, he said, and his voice carried something that might have been respect, or might have been apology, or both. I believe this meeting belongs to you. Emeka stood up. This was not a composed movement. It was a movement of a man whose body had decided to act before his mind had caught up, a pushing back of the chair, a rising, a standing that served no immediate purpose. He stood, and he looked at his wife across the width of the boardroom table, and something in his face rearranged itself. What is this? He said. His voice was still controlled. The boardroom was still watching. He was still, in his own assessment, the man who stood at the head of this table. You know what it is? Adiz said, not loudly, not with victory, simply with the tone of a woman who had rehearsed a different conversation, a longer, quieter, more private one, and found herself in this one instead. This is, he stopped. He looked at Chief Coker. He looked at Funmi. He looked briefly at Tara, who was still standing at the presentation screen with the remote in her hand, the slide still glowing behind her. This is family business. This is not. This, Chief Coker said, with the patience of a much older man, is a corporate equity matter, which makes it board business. Emeka sat back down. The conversation that followed was clinical, measured, and devastating in the way only corporate language can be devastating. Not with raised voices, but with a quiet succession of facts. Bar. Chisholm Ease had joined the meeting via video link at 9:06. Adiz had arranged this in advance, and she walked aboard to the timeline with the precision of someone who had been preparing this presentation for months. Because she had. Zora Capital Partners had been the founding investor. It held 54% of the company. Its registered beneficial owner had always been Adiz and Wosu Okafor. This had never been hidden. It was in the original CAC filings, accessible to anyone who had looked. No one had looked. The board listened. The board asked questions. The questions were answered. Emeka sat in silence through most of it. But then, and this was the moment Adiz had not fully anticipated, the moment that changed the temperature of the room. Emeka turned to her and said something she had not expected. He said, quietly enough that perhaps only the people nearest him heard clearly, "You embarrass me. Not I'm sorry. Not why didn't you tell me. Not I didn't know. You embarrass me." Adiz looked at her husband for the length of a breath. She saw, in that moment, the whole shape of everything. 12 years, 250 million naira, 3 restructurings. For board election she had managed quietly from the sidelines. The night she had sat in a hospital in Enugu with her father 3 weeks before he died and had told him, "The company is safe, Daddy, it's safe. She saw all of it, and she said nothing, because there was nothing she needed to say. Adiz reached into her folder and withdrew one more document. She set it on the table in front of her, not sliding it, not handing it across. She simply placed it there, face up, with both hands flat beside it, and looked at Emeka. It was a board resolution, dated that morning, already signed by 4 of the 7 required board members. Emeka looked at the document. He read the title. His face did not collapse. Men like Emeka did not collapse in public. But something behind his eyes went somewhere it would not come back from easily. The resolution proposed a formal recognition of Adiz Nwosu Okafor as executive chairperson of Okafor Holdings, replacing the current executive structure, pending a full board vote. Chief Coker cleared his throat. "I'll note for the record," he said, "that I signed this document this morning, as did 3 other members of this board." He looked at the remaining 3. "I'd like to call the vote." Tara Ease, in the 37 minutes she had been in this room, had not spoken since her presentation was interrupted. She was still standing. At some point, the presentation remote had left her hand. She was looking at Emeka with an expression that Adiz recognized, not from her own face, but from her memory. It was the expression of a person who has just realized they had been walking on a floor that was never as solid as they thought. Emeka stood again. "This is not," he stopped. "I need to speak with my wife. Privately, before any vote." "The vote is a corporate matter," Funmi said. "It doesn't require your wife's privacy. She is my wife." His voice had shifted. The boardroom polish had thinned, and underneath it was something rawer. Not quite anger, but the precursor to it. "I built this company. I have given this company." "Emeka." Chief Coker's voice was not unkind. "Sit down." The room held its breath. Emeka looked at Chief Coker. He looked at Adiz. She met his eyes. She gave him nothing to hold on to. He sat. The vote was called. 5 in favor. 1 abstention. 1 absence. The resolution passed. At 9:41 a.m., in the boardroom of Okafor Holdings on the 41st floor of a building that Lagos had watched rise, year by year, into the sky, Adiz Nwosu Okafor was formally recognized as what she had always been. The vote was quiet. The city outside did not stop. The rain had long since passed. She had not planned for anger. That was the thing people would assume, later, that what Adiz had put in motion had been driven by rage, by the cold, compacted fury of a woman scorned. The newspapers would say it in different ways. The whisper networks on Lagos Twitter would say it in the same way. They said everything, loudly, incorrectly, and without context. None of them would understand that the preparation had not begun in anger. It had begun in a hospital room in Enugu, with her father's hand in hers. Chief Emmanuel Nwosu had known he was dying for 6 months before he told anyone. He was that kind of man, measured, private, careful about the weight he placed on other people's shoulders. He had told Adiz last, because she was the one he was most afraid of burdening. She had held his hand in that hospital room and listened to him talk for 2 hours about the land, about the family, about the choices he had made and the ones he regretted, about Zora Capital Partners, the entity he had helped to construct, the one that held everything she had seeded into the company. "Your name is in every document," he had said. "Not hidden, not complicated, just waiting for someone to look." "No one has looked," she had told him. "They will," he said. "When the time is right, they will." He had died 11 days later. Adiz had gone back to Lagos and buried her grief the way she buried most things. Quietly, without public ceremony, in a place no one else could easily access. The preparation had begun 3 months after his death. She had started with the documents, a full audit of every filing Okafor Holdings had submitted to the CAC in 12 years. She had found no fraud, no deliberate erasure of her contributions. What she had found was something almost more disturbing. Omission, year by year, in every press release, every media feature, every annual report, her name had simply not appeared. The company had a founder. The company had a visionary. The company had a CEO, a chairman, and a board. None of those things were named Adiz Nwosu Okafor. She had looked at those documents for a long time. Then she had called Bar. Chisholm Ease. Chisholm was not a dramatic woman. She was, in a Dee's experience, the most unromantic person she had ever trusted with something consequential, which was precisely why she trusted her. Chisholm dealt in what was true and what was provable. She did not deal in what was fair or unfair or what people deserved. Those were other conversations. Together, they had spent 4 months doing one thing, making visible what had always been there. The equity structure had never been altered. Zora Capital Partners still held 54%. The registration documents still named the Dees as the beneficial owner. The original investment agreement, a 12-year-old document drafted in Chisholm's office on a Tuesday afternoon with Chief Emanuel present, was intact, valid, and had never been contested. There was nothing to prove. There was only something to show. One evening, 3 weeks before the board meeting, a Dees had sat at her kitchen table. Not the table in the formal dining room, but the small one in the corner near the window where she drank her coffee, and she had read, one final time, the original investment agreement. She had not cried. She had folded it, returned it to its envelope, and placed it in the center of the table. Then she had sat for a very long time with her hands in her lap, listening to the sound of the house. She had also, and this she had done alone, without telling Chisholm, sat for 2 evenings in the study and written her father a letter, not to send, just to write. She had told him what she was about to do. She had told him she was not angry. She had told him she was just finally deciding to be seen. She folded both letters and placed them in the same drawer where she kept his photograph. The board had not been recruited. That was important to understand. A Dees had not lobbied or pressured or campaigned. What she had done was ensure that 4 specific board members, Chief Coker, Funme, and 2 others who had known her longest, received the relevant documents through proper channels 2 weeks before the meeting. She had included no cover letter, no appeal, only the documents, with a brief note. For your review, ahead of the upcoming board session, they had all come to their own conclusions. That was the nature of documented truth. You did not need to argue for it. You only needed to place it where it could be read. There was one thing left that she had prepared alone, without Chisholm, without lawyers, without paperwork. She had prepared herself. She had gone, the night before the board meeting, to the same room where she and Emeka had argued, quietly, without raised voices, in the way all their serious conversations happened, when he had told her about the COO proposal. She had stood in the doorway of that room and looked at the bed they had shared for 12 years, and she had made the only decision that mattered, the one that had nothing to do with equity or documents. She had decided that she was not going to be reduced by this, not diminished, not made smaller, not walked out her own life with her head down, as though she had failed at something. She had not failed. She had built, and building, her father had always said, was the only thing a person could never have taken from them. Not the thing itself, perhaps, but the knowing, the knowledge of what you made. That stayed. She had slept well that night. At 9:47 a.m., 6 minutes after the board vote, the meeting should have ended. Instead, it continued. Not because the Dees prolonged it. Not because anyone was dramatic. It continued because Emeka Okafor, who had sat in silence for several minutes after the vote, stood up a second time, and this time he looked at the security desk phone mounted on the wall beside the boardroom door. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked it up. "This is Emeka Okafor," he said into the phone. "Send 2 security personnel to the 41st floor boardroom. Immediately." The room did not move. Chief Coker set his pen down. Funme looked up from her notepad. A Dees did not look at the phone. She looked at her water glass. Emeka replaced the receiver. He straightened his jacket. He looked at a Dees with an expression that had moved past calculation into something uglier. Not rage, but the thing that lives beside rage in men who cannot afford the appearance of it. A cold, final assertion. "You are my wife," he said, "and I am asking you to leave this boardroom." The silence that followed was of specific quality, not empty, not waiting. It was the silence of a room full of people who understood they were witnessing something that would be spoken about for a long time. A Dees picked up her water glass. She took a sip. She set it down. She did not leave. 2 security personnel, arrived in under 3 minutes. Young men in the company uniform. Men Adiz recognized. Men she had seen in the lobby for years. Men whose Christmas envelopes she had prepared last December with the same careful attention she gave everything. They entered the room and stopped. They looked at Emeka. They looked at the boardroom full of board members. They looked at Adiz. One of them, a tall man named Segan, who had worked the building security for 9 years, seemed to understand something in that moment that the other one was still catching up to. His face did not change, but something in his posture shifted. Emeka said, "Escort my wife out of the boardroom." Neither of them moved. Chief Coker stood. He was 71 years old. He was not a large man, and he moved with the particular deliberateness of a man who no longer felt the need to hurry. He walked to the space between Emeka and the security personnel. He did not raise his voice. "These men," he said, "work for Okafor Holdings, which is as of 41 minutes ago, and as of 12 years ago, if we are being accurate, majority owned by the woman you are attempting to remove from this room." He looked at Emeka with the patience of a man who had watched many other men make very bad decisions. "I would suggest you think very carefully about what you are asking." Emeka looked at Segan. Segan looked at the floor. Then Segan looked up, not at Emeka, but across the room, at Adiz, and he did something that no one in that room would forget. He straightened, just slightly, a small adjustment of a man orienting himself toward the person who was actually in authority. He said quietly, "Ma, do you want us to leave?" Adiz held. Segan's gaze for 1 second, just one. Then she nodded once slowly and said, "Yes, you can go." Her voice did not shake. It did not carry triumph. It was simply the voice of a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be. The 2 security personnel left the room. The door closed. Emeka stood in the center of the boardroom, at the head of the table where he had always stood, where he had signed contracts and accepted awards and posed for photographs. And for the first time in 12 years, the room's attention was not on him. It had moved. Quietly, thoroughly, irreversibly. Tara Ease, who had been standing near the presentation screen for the past 40 minutes, picked up her bag. She said nothing to Emeka. She said nothing to anyone. She moved toward the door with the speed of someone whose only remaining priority was to leave before anything else happened. She left. The door closed again. Funmi spoke. "I think we should take a short recess. 20 minutes. Then we'll continue with the full transition agenda." People began to move. Folders closed. Phones were retrieved. The quiet, purposeful motion of people exiting a room with a great deal to think about. Emeka did not move. Adiz stood. She buttoned her blazer, one button deliberate, unhurried. She gathered her folder. She moved to leave. As she passed ahead of the table, she paused. She did not look at Emeka. She was not avoiding him. She simply had nothing that needed to be said in that moment, and she had learned, over 12 long years, the difference between silence as avoidance and silence as completion. She walked to the door. She opened it. Behind her, Emeka said one thing, just one, and she heard it clearly because the room was empty enough to carry sound. He said, "Ada," not her full name, not with anger, just Ada, the way he had said it when they were young, before Lagos, before the boards, before the company had grown into something that dwarfed both of them. Just her name, reduced to its most essential syllable, in the voice of a man standing at the beginning of understanding something that could not be taken back. She stopped. She did not turn. She stood in the open doorway for the length of a breath. Then she walked out. The next 72 hours move in a way that all significant events move when they happen in Lagos. Fast, public, and with a particular intensity, a city that never agreed to be a bystander to anything. By noon on the day of the board meeting, 2 things had happened on the internet that Adiz had not arranged and could not have predicted. Someone had leaked the broad strokes of the morning's events. Not the documents, not the legal details, but the shape of the story. CEO's wife revealed as majority owner. Husband at security tried to remove her. She stayed. Board voted in her favor. Lagos absorbed this information and did what Lagos did. It talked. The responses were layered, as they always were. There were the women in the WhatsApp groups who said quietly that they had known something like this existed somewhere in the world and were glad to have proof. There were the men on Twitter who said the story was exaggerated. Must be more to it. No man could be that blind to his own company's ownership. There were the business journalists who called the company's PR line every 15 minutes and received, for 2 days, the same polite response. A statement will be issued in due course. Adiz wrote the statement herself. Chisholm reviewed it. It was 4 paragraphs. It did not use the word betrayal. It did not use the word victory. It said, in clear professional language, that a transition of executive leadership was underway, that the board had voted in favor of the change, and that the company looked forward to a continued period of growth. She had not mentioned Emeka by name. She had not mentioned Tara at all. Emeka left the Lekki compound 4 days after the board meeting. He did not leave dramatically. He did not leave with speeches or slam doors. He packed a bag, a carry-on, mostly, as though the departure was temporary, which perhaps he still believed it was, and he sat for a while in the kitchen where they had eaten breakfast for 12 years, and then he left. Adiz was not in the house when he left. She was at the office. She found out through the housekeeper, who told her quietly the way people in that house had always communicated important things. Quietly, without performance. She nodded and thanked the woman for telling her. She did not go home early. Tara Ease's employment was formally terminated 6 days after the board meeting, following a standard review of her appointment pathway. The termination letter cited procedural irregularities in her original SOO appointment. It was signed by Funmi Adeyemi on behalf of the new executive leadership. Adiz did not sign it. She had made that choice deliberately. There were things she would not carry the personal weight of, and the dismantling of Tara Ease's position was one of them. It was a structural matter. It would be handled structurally. What she did carry, what she held quietly in the private hours, in the corner kitchen by the window, was something more complicated than what the WhatsApp groups and business pages were calling her victory. She sat with the fact that she had loved Emeka, not in the uncomplicated way of the early years, not the wide-open way of a young woman who had looked at a confident man with ideas and seen something worth building toward. That was gone. It had been going for a long time. But there had been something there, something real, some thread of shared history, of meals and travel, and a miscarriage in 2017 that they had never spoken about properly, of small morning rituals and a particular way he laughed when something genuinely surprised him. That had been real, and she sat with its loss the way she sat with all losses. Quietly, with both hands. The company continued. 2 weeks after the board meeting, Adiz convened her first formal leadership session as executive chairperson. She wore the same navy Ankara trim blazer. She arrived before the cleaning staff had finished. She sat in the seat at the end of the conference table that she had always chosen. This time, she chose the head, not to announce herself, not to perform authority, but because there are moments when accuracy matters, when sitting in the correct seat is simply the most honest available action, and honesty, her father had always said, was the most durable form of courage there was. The board members filed in. Chief Coker arrived first. He looked at her in her new seat for a moment. He said nothing. He sat down, opened his folder, and waited for the meeting to begin. There's a Yoruba proverb that says, "Ibado to ba fo lenuapati, keo bagbi iro erori." The corn that falls from the grinding stone does not forget the shape of itself. Adiz had heard this from her father as a child, when she had come home from school cry because a teacher had told her that girls were not suited to mathematics. Her father had said it without drama, in passing, while tending the small garden behind their Enugu house, and she had not fully understood it then. She had written it down in her school notebook and carried it with her across every year since. The way certain words attach themselves to you when you are young and stay attached regardless of where you travel. She understood it now. 6 weeks after the board meeting, Adiz drove herself to Enugu, not with a driver, not with a PA or an assistant or a board member. She drove herself in the early morning, before Lagos had fully woken, and she took the familiar road north, past the filling stations, past the patches of forest that persisted along the highway, past the long flat stretches where you could see the sky without any building interrupting it. She arrived at her father's house in the late afternoon. It was quiet in the way she had been carrying in her memory for years. The compound, the garden he had kept, the 300 hectares beyond the fence that were still Technically, part of the inheritance the lawyers had processed through Zora Capital Partners. The soil was reddish, the way a Nugu soil often was. Familiar. She walked the land for an hour, without her phone. She thought about what she would do next. Not with the company. That she understood clearly. The roadmap was written. The team was assembled. The restructure was underway. The company, at last, would be run by the person who had built it. She thought instead about herself, about who she was on the far side of this, about what a woman becomes when the thing she has spent 12 years quietly proving is finally publicly proven, and whether becoming is even the right word, or whether it had always been this way. And the only thing that had changed was that the rest of the world had caught up to what she had always known. Her father's grave was in the small family cemetery behind the main house. She visited it, as she always did. Not with flowers, though she brought them, but with words. She stood at the headstone and told him about the board meeting, about Chief Coker, about Segan, the security guard who had looked at her and oriented himself toward the actual authority in the room, about Emeka, about what she had and had not felt. She told him about the letter she had written him, the one that was still in the drawer in Lagos. She told him she had slept well that night before the board meeting. She told him she thought he would have found that funny, in the quiet way he found things funny. The sun was low by the time she finished speaking. The land was long and orange and still. She stood there until the light changed. Then she got back into the car. She adjusted the mirror. She looked at her own face for a moment. Steady, older than the face she had carried in her mind for years, belonging entirely to itself. She thought of the corn, the grinding stone, the shape of things. The corn that falls from the grinding stone does not forget the shape of itself. It lands. It lies still. It waits for the right season. And when the season comes, it grows. Some women do not rise. They simply become visible, standing exactly where they have always stood, waiting for the world to finally look.